Good morning, Chris. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Gary. Great to be with you.
First question, coming right out of the box. Did we really invade Canada? Is that true?
Well, we did, as a matter of fact, even though we have this very long and peaceful border with Canada, and even though we've fought 2 world wars together as allies, and that Canada is probably our closest, the closest country to the United States in the world, that nevertheless, we did, going way back, actually invade what is today Canada. We did, during the American Revolution, there was a siege of Quebec that began actually 1775, and then also we invaded during the War of 1812. And in both of those invasions, I actually had ancestors from New York that participated. James Van Rensselaer during the American Revolution, and then Stephen Van Rensselaer, who was the general who headed up the New York militia that invaded during the War of 1812.
So we did, indeed. It's hard to believe. I think people waking up this morning are going, we invaded Canada? Is that true? Wow.
We did. Yes, there's in the Albany Rural Cemetery. I've visited the grave of Stephen Van Rensselaer, General Van Rensselaer, who headed up this New York militia, and they have the marker of a veteran of the War of 1812, which is of course pretty rare. There weren't that many soldiers compared to things like World War II and Vietnam and many others, of course.
Right, and we're going to talk about your books here in a moment, Chris, but I also understand that we invaded Russia in 1918, according to my notes.
We did, that's correct. It was called the Polar Bear Expedition, and a lot of these guys came from Michigan, and they invaded what is northern Russia, areas like Murmansk and Archangel, and there was also a group from the Pacific that landed in Vladivostok too, in conjunction with Japanese allies. This is during World War I, and what was happening was that Russia was convulsed by this revolution, and it had been an ally fighting against the Germans, and then America joined the war against the Germans in 1917, and we were worried that the Russians were going wobbly, so to speak, and were going to be, no longer keep fighting the Germans. So they were troops that were sent, and the Americans were part of that expedition to Russia back then.
Wow, so early in the morning, and I've already learned a lot, quite a history lesson we have going here, Chris. I'm enjoying this. I'm glad that all those things were in the past. Now, we'll talk about the future here in a few minutes, but as I mentioned in your introduction, you're a military historian, so tell us about some of the other invasions here that the United States has been a part of. Well,
in our book, America Invades, we talked about, we had a chapter devoted to every country in the world, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, and talked about the American military involvement with almost every country in the world. And the only 3 that we missed entirely, according to our research, were Andorra, Bhutan, and Liechtenstein. So Americans have really gotten around, and that was definitely our conclusion of our book.
Wow.
One of the very first ones was 1741. It actually was what is today Colombia, and there was a war going on then in 1741 between the British and the Spanish called the War of Jenkins' Ear, and there was an expedition led by Edmund Vernon of the Royal Navy, and there were about 3,500 colonial American troops that participated, and one of these was a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Washington, who was the older half-brother of George, and the expedition wasn't successful, but Lawrence must have formed a high opinion of his commanding officer, because he named his home Mount Vernon in his honor. And when George inherited it from his brother, he retained that name. So there's a connection between the very first American invasion and our founding fathers' first president's home.
I always thought we were a very passive and peaceful country here, and you're telling me that Andorra, Bhutan, and Liechtenstein are the only countries that we haven't invaded?
Those are the 3 we've missed entirely, and I've actually been to Liechtenstein and talked to them and gotten an article in the newspaper about the fact that we missed them, but for some reason. But yeah, no, there may be some future president's to-do list. I don't know. But those are the ones we've missed so far. Everyone else and it isn't that we've invaded every one of those, but there are ones that, for instance, we've been militarily involved with in a significant way. Like Portugal, for instance. We haven't invaded Portugal, but we've had bases on the Azores since World War II, and they're still there to this day. I mean, we still have a presence in Portugal now.
Are there any real quirky invasions that we've been in? I know you've kind of mentioned some of them already.
All right. there are some ones that are. I mean, most war is a very serious business with loss of lives and treasure and all that.
Right.
But then there are some wars that are kind of ridiculous. I mean, like there was one that was called the Pig War, which was kind of, and the only casualty of this. This was on an island in my home state of Washington, in the San Juans, and it was a dispute between the British and the Americans, and ultimately over control of whether this island would be British or Canadian, really, or American. And the only casualty of this war was actually a pig that was shot by. And this is talking back in 1859 that this went on.
Well, I guess better than a pig than humans. I would say that. We're having a great conversation with Christopher Kelly here, who is a military historian. Chris, what got you interested in this?
Well, I've always had a lifelong passion for history and military history in particular, but all kinds of history. And so that was, and I have had a chance to do it. I mean, for me, it's become, I guess, more than a hobby, less than a business, something like that. And so I really, and it's also a great excuse to travel too. I take lots of photography of the places that I write about in my books and include that in the books as well, so that that readers can really see what was going on as well as read about it too.
Where do we stand as far as, and I say we, I mean the United States, where do we rank as far as the number of invasions that we've been a part of compared to other world powers like Russia?
That's a good question, because I mean, I have a co-author, and my co-author is on some of my books on America Invades and Italy Invades too. His name is Stuart Laycock, and he's English, and he wrote actually the first book in our series before me, which was called All the Countries We've Invaded, about how Britain invaded 90% of all the countries in the world. So compared to Britain, we're really kind of America has invaded about 44%, 85 countries that we've been, had actually, boots on the ground and actually fought in. But we're not. I mean, the British have actually far more than us, for example.
As I mentioned, we've been talking about the past. Let's talk about the present and even the future and cyber war and the internet. Does that change what we would call an invasion?
Yeah, I do think it really has changed. I mean, in the old days, it used to be send in the Marines, and today it's something more like send in the nerds, because cyber warfare and the vulnerability of our country and the West to cyber attack is real and is ongoing. And so, yeah, I think that I mean, what constitutes an invasion, you can say it really has changed. And what if they did go after the banks and think? I mean, how would a country respond to that? How does a country need to defend itself against an attack that's not, by an army or an air force, but with, or checking accounts or credit scores?
Well, that is going on. I mean, that war.
Absolutely.
We're waging that war right now, and even as we speak here early in the morning, I'm sure somebody's trying to hack your bank account. Chris, sorry, I have to tell you that. I think you probably already knew that, but
yeah, no, it's something that people definitely need to be aware of. Because it's a definite cause for concern, I'd say. Sure. Absolutely.
And let's talk about your books. As I mentioned, I believe you told me you've written 3 books.
I'm on number 3. My first one was called America Invades, and how we've been militarily involved with almost every country on Earth. That I wrote with Stu Laycock. We followed it up with Italy Invades, how Italians conquered the world, and we do a similar thing where we go through every country in the world and talk about the Italian impact on almost every country.
Can you elaborate on that a little?
Was America's the superpower, but we talk about Italy including things like Rome. So, I mean, Rome was in many ways the model for America. I mean, they had an eagle as a symbol. We have an eagle. They had a Senate. We have a Senate. They had a republic. We have a republic as well. So there are lots of parallels, I think, between the Italians and the United States today.
Great. Okay. And your other book? Yeah.
My most recent book has just come out. It's called An Adventure 1914, which has a real New York connection. It features a memoir that was written by my great-grandfather, Thomas Tyleston Wells, who was a New York lawyer. And he was traveling with his wife and 2 kids in the summer of 1914 through Europe, in Switzerland and Austria and the Alps and so forth when the war broke out, and he was kind of caught up with it in it. And at one point, he was actually arrested and accused of being a Russian spy and threatened with execution. And he had to kind of talk his way out of that. And readers can find out how in the book.
Wow! And these books are available at.
Yes, you can find the books at our own websites and on Amazon, AmericaInvades.com, ItalyInvades.com, and An Adventure in 1914.com.
Okay, and you mentioned Amazon, of course, which...
On Amazon as well, and
right.
also on Kindle, of course, too.
And probably Borders.
A lot of bookstores as well.
Right, yeah. It's getting to the point where there isn't anything Amazon doesn't have. It's almost automatic. And before
I'm excited about Adventure because it's like my most personal book, and in a way, it's kind of like a message in a bottle from 100 years ago. And he was, my great grandfather was witness to this kind of greatest train wreck in history, the outbreak of World War I.
You were quoted as saying the world can change fundamentally in a single day.
I think that's true. I mean, it happened recently on Election Day, but it happened, that the world has changed. 9/11, the world changed, of course, fundamentally. On December 7th, 1941, the world changed fundamentally. And the point I made in this book about World War I is that on June 28th, 1914, you had the double assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo at the hands of a Bosnian assassin from the Black Hand, which was basically the event a terrorist event that triggered the start of World War I over 100 years ago, of course.
Having a great conversation with Chris Kelly here. And Chris, I will give you the last word. Why don't you mention your contact information again? And I'm sure you must be on Facebook and Twitter and all that.
Yes, I'm on Facebook and Twitter as well. My name is Christopher Kelly, and it's AmericaInvades.com, ItalyInvades.com, and An Adventure in 1914.com.
And how about some words going forward? Leave me with some words of wisdom.
Well, I think it's interesting. The question is, does history repeat itself? And here are a few.
Yes.
Recently, we had the Cubs win the World Series
Right.
after a 100-year gap.
Right.
So maybe history doesn't always repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Chris, thank you for joining us this morning, and thanks for all the great history lesson.
Thanks very much, Gary.
And
appreciate it.
I certainly appreciate your time. And ladies and gentlemen, check out Chris's books.